All right. I am going to copy and send you a link.
Okay.
And that is
share it, hopefully.
Oh, that was just me. All right. I think we've put all the notifications out. Graham, thank you very much for joining me today. I'm so excited. We've spent about 15 minutes that just flew by with you telling me all kinds of things that I feel like I already should know. And I think the folks out, the internet folks, as they tend to call themselves, or some of them call themselves the choir, they're going to be fascinated by some of the things that you've said so far. Now, if you're joining us today, I'm sitting here I'm sitting across from a great gentleman out of close to Fredericton, New Brunswick. He's studying for his master's degree at the University of New Brunswick in history with a major in Black Maritime history.
It's a focus on Black Loyalist history.
Very good. His name's Graham Nickerson. So in the comments, just say hello to Graham Nickerson. Can I ask, are you planning on going for your PhD as well?
I'm planning on it. Sometimes the amount of commitment that's going to require is a bit scary, but I can't, like, this research and it wants to be done, and I want to be the vehicle to make it happen. So we'll see how it goes.
Just wondering
oh, go ahead.
I just wondered if we should start calling you now.
Well, I'm hoping that what I've done in my master's, I'll be able to publish as a book, and that'll be a start.
Very good. So just to give you a heads up, this channel has people from, well, if I look at this right now, V Nix, she's in Belgium. Edgar's in Dallas, Texas. Jake is in Iowa. So we have people from Australia who will be tuning in, people from all over Canada, all over the United States, all over Europe, Central America, South America. We do have some people from Africa that follow us as well. So this is kind of neat. Like, you're going to have a global audience here. Don't screw up.
Well, hopefully we can, like, one of the things about how I'm studying Black history is it ties all of these areas together. And so there are, for instance, you say Belgium, and so there's a guy named, who you may be familiar with, Henry Beverhout. So my wife is Dutch, and I know that Beverhout, which is beaver hide. So somewhere along the line, there's a Dutch or Belgian connection with that person who was enslaved at one time, and so there's this. It's just connections after connections and you're like. And it always ends up being like, I never knew that. And then it leads to something else.
Now, Graham, I'm going to get you to tell us about yourself. But before I do, one of the things that we talked about coming into this was any of the money that's donated through the super chats on YouTube. So super chats are where people can donate a couple of dollars, and oftentimes they ask a question or they make a nice statement or whatever. And whatever is raised from the super chats of this particular conversation, we will use that towards creating and commemorating a plaque for Pastor David George.
Yes. David George has absolutely no footprint in Shelburne. And it's a travesty. Like, anybody who's from there right now, you should be like going, okay, I'm going to write my mayor, I'm going to write my MP and my legislative member to say, why is this happening? David George is the founder, or one of the founders of the Silver Springs Baptist Church in Georgia, South Carolina. And he comes up here, he brings Baptist religion with him, and starts the first African Baptist church in Canada, and then migrates out in 1792 and establishes the Baptist church in Sierra Leone. His contemporaries end up starting the Baptist church in Jamaica. And I think there are elsewhere you'll probably find he's really well connected within the church. And he brings his presence in Shelburne, brings all of these movers and shakers within the abolitionist and religious community. And you would never know anything about it anyway. There's no record of it whatsoever. And so one of the things I've been trying to do, I'm working with the Black Loyalist Heritage Society to make sure that we start to commemorate some of these Black people who they're unmarked, and it's time for that to change.
Perfect. Tell us about yourself.
Myself, okay, so I'm originally from Shelburne, Nova Scotia. I like to try and tell stories that go full circle. So I will do that right now until you cut the mic, right? I graduated in '89, went to Toronto. I ended up being an electronic technician and then went to sea. And I worked in seismic, and I'm still a marine scientist by training. And so when you're at sea now, you feel like you're in a foreign space that belongs to white people, right? There's no segment of it that looks like you generally. So I ended up, that's a thing I did for a long time. And then I've always been interested in history and been a public historian for a long time. I worked with, so there's a guy named John LaRue, who's the curator at the Beaverbrook Art Gallery here in Fredericton. And I worked with him on a project with Charmaine Nelson, who is one of Canada's leading Black historians. Look her up, she's brilliant. And both her and John were like, you need to do a PhD. And so I was like, okay, well, like I told you, it's like, well, everything about Black history is really, everybody knows it already. But I decided I would take it on. And so I'm working under Dr. Elizabeth Mankey in the history department at UNB. And so now my studies I started off looking at things in general and have slowly focused in on Black maritime history, only to find out that Black loyalists, there's like crazy stories about the significance of Blacks in the maritime industry from time immemorial to like technologies like the sea anchor invented in Africa. Sea shanties, African. So essentially, looking at it that way, you start to see like there's this world that existed before the 1850s, 1860s, which there's this transition that cuts Blacks out of the story. First of all, there's like the Negro Siemens Act, which means it prohibits Blacks from traveling to the South because they're full of ideas that are dangerous to slavery. But also, whites want to take over this business. And since Blacks aren't allowed to attend university or college in most places, the Industrial Revolution brings an end to wind and sail. And because Blacks aren't suited to do technical work because of their education, they pretty much then transition to railways and they become railway porters and things like that. So the history through the 1960s and 70s, where there's this huge Black presence in the railway industry, is the descendant of Blacks being part of the marine industry and basically being forced out. And now I was part of it back in my previous life, and now I'm part of it telling that story, but from a Canadian perspective. Oh, You're muted.
Oops. It's really fascinating that I asked you to tell us about yourself, and you spent 5 minutes drawing connections between where you are today and where people of African descent were over the last 200 years. This is obviously a huge part of who you are.
It has taken over my life, really, and in good ways, mostly good ways. Sometimes it's a challenge because you're like, I know this stuff. Every day I'm researching, and then I have to contend with somebody's cousin who says, "Oh no, those are lies," right? And so it's like, so sometimes it's your work is just not very well received, but through my education, I'm sort of leaving, like, I don't really much care anymore. So it's like, okay, this is the truth. You can take it or not. And
well, somebody's cousin always does know better.
yes, yeah, because I saw a meme of it on social media somewhere.
Yeah, well, absolutely. It was on Twitter. You didn't catch that? Okay. Let's jump in. So you're studying history from the Black Maritime context, from the perspective. Can you shed a little light? So as my channel, I've done some videos on this, and the people here know, and actually a friend of mine here has logged in, Bothered Boy from up in the Ottawa area, and he's done a whole month on Black history. It's been phenomenal. He's actually found that his videos haven't been getting haven't been getting promoted the way his other videos were being promoted. And anyway, the bottom line is, I'd really love to know, could you start us off by giving us a little bit of a taste, a little bit of the experience that the Black Loyalists would have had as they came north?
Okay. So as I said in our preamble before we went live, what tends to happen in Black Canadian history is that we, like, for Black Loyalists at least, is we look at 1783 as the beginning, and then don't look into the US really. And this is a Canadian phenomenon, because there are Americans who look at this stuff, but it's like their stories end in either, and they all died, or they went off to Nova Scotia, and you never get this story that bridges that period. It's just one ends or one begins. So in one of the other things we need to do is we have to kind of handle the term Black Loyalists with a little bit of caution, because we're basically taking everyone from the 13 colonies into the Caribbean, Africans, and we're saying, oh, they were all one people, and they all felt the same way, and they all did the same things, and they all did it for the same reasons. And that's not the way it is. So I tend to focus on two aspects, but there are probably more. And anybody who has things they want to add or argue about, that's fine. I'd love to know more angles that I haven't thought about. But you have the Black Loyalist military component, which are the people who by and large are either part of the Company of Negroes in 1776, who accompany the British to Halifax and then go back to New York, or the Blacks who respond to Lord Dunmore's call in 1775 in the Chesapeake. And then later, a little bit in 1779 with the Philipsburg Proclamation. And I won't get into all this stuff because we'd be days, but especially if I'm explaining it. But look it up, and like these are important pieces of the story. But so you have these people who are by and large, they're military, and they make up the original organization of the companies of Blacks who come up are based on military organization. Then you have the religious side, and those are people like David George, who's he's somewhat military, but mostly through the realm of religion. Boston King, Moses Wilkinson. And so they all have these very different views of not only religion, because you have all the religious sects. You have Black Quakers and Black Methodists and Black Baptists. You have Black Anglicans through the SPG, or Society for the Propagation of the Gospel. And so they're all together, and they're all from all over the place. And before they come to Nova Scotia, they're scattered in Savannah, Charleston, and New York. And so they all sort of get lumped together, either in New York, or they come up to Nova Scotia directly, and they arrive here and through the summer of 1783, but also into the late winter, or early winter, I should say, and into like up until 1785. So it's chaos. Really, what it amounts to, the short answer is chaos. And they have to deal with the elements. Some of those people who are arriving and who leave New York City on November 30th in what was known as the year without summer. So you can imagine. And we don't really know how many perished that first year. So there's a topic that remains yet to be explored. We know we have the Black burial ground in Birchtown, but that might be a Black burial ground, and there may be more. And there may be, I've people contact me, and there are at least a couple of other burial grounds in Shelburne County that people think were probably Black, and stories of bones and people finding skeletons, and it's just like crazy, really. We're just getting started.
Behind you on your picture there, that's one of the original dwellings that the Black Loyalists, that if I remember right, or at least
Yes.
It looks like the A-frames that the Black Loyalists would have been dug out of the ground when they came here to Shelburne.
So that's a pit house. And so if you go to Birchtown Museum, you will find a version of this there. This is a version that a guy named Joe G, hopefully he's watching, he and I built this. Well, he built it and I kind of talked a lot, pretty much. But we built this at King's Landing in New Brunswick. And so it's described as a simple dwelling, but that's usually, that term is used by people who've never built one. There's nothing simple about building a pit house. It requires about a week's worth of time in like sun up to sundown in summer, not in sun up to sundown in November. It requires a fair amount of wood and stone, and that vertical log there is a flue. So there is some anecdotal evidence that said that they did use these hollowed out logs as for a fireplace. Mm-hmm. So it took us a week to build it, and we had to rope in. So we had a backhoe. We were going to do that part by hand, and it was like, no, we'll never do this. We sort of like went ting ting to the ground, and so anyway, what you're going to ask something?
Well, I thought that was really interesting. So if you're just catching us now, this is we're speaking with Graham Nickerson. Anybody that happens to have a question or anything, please let us know in the chats or in the super chats. Whatever comes in through super chats is going to go for a donation towards the creation and the commemoration of a plaque for Pastor David Edwards, who was a man of African descent here in Shelburne back in the late 1700s that even many people here in Shelburne don't know anything about. But what you mentioned about digging the pit house, and you said that, it takes a long time, but you brought a backhoe in to get through the ground.
Yes.
The ground
There's a video
here. Oh, it's just the ground here in Shelburne County. The ground here in Birchtown, where some of these pit houses were found, they wouldn't have 3 inches of soil on it before you hit nothing but rock after rock. And we're not talking rocks the size of your hands. We're not talking rocks the size of your head. we're talking rocks the size of a car. And yet
Yes.
the Black Loyalists who came up, like that's what they faced. And I also thought it was fascinating because I never drew the connection that you just drew. That some of the folks that were coming up here a month, 2 months before were living in New York City.
Yes.
And now they're told, now go dig yourself a pit house.
Yeah. So we really, okay. So now we're talking about two things at the same time. So I'll try and get it together. And so first of all, the main thing to take away from the pit house construction is you have 1,000 people or 1,500 people in Birchtown. And all of those people are looking at the same raw material, same lumber, same implements, the moss, the rope. They're all scrambling around at the onset of winter to build shelter. So it takes superior leadership to make that happen without it being a catastrophe. We're not talking about the mass extinction of Black Loyalists. We're still here. So somebody in that group, or people in that group, were able to marshal people and get them to do the things they needed to do, to feed people, to get raw material, go into Shelburne and get the rations from Commissary Island, and all of that stuff. Now, the other thing is that, so we're talking about a few things that factor in. And so they are in New York, but many of those people would have lived through 1780, which was called the Hard Winter. So they would have had the experience, of winter in New York City, and a harsh winter, not a mild winter. And so they would have known. And plus you had those people who spent a winter up here in 1776 who would have been like, oh, we're going back to Nova Scotia. We need to be ready. Now, I think secondary to this part of it is that Benjamin Marston and Colonel Stephen Bluke went to Birchtown, and Stephen Bluke was happy with the location. So again, when we were talking earlier, it's like you need to reorient yourself from looking at people thinking that they're going to build farms. That may have been part of it, but that probably most of them weren't farmers. They were tradesmen or aligned with the maritime industry. And so if you look out towards the bay and you're like, we can set up a maritime economy in Birchtown, by which we're sailors and fishermen and ships pilots. And we don't just walk to Sheldon, we row to Sheldon, and we get our stuff and we row back. And we're far enough away that we're not going to be bothered by white people who we just lived in New York City with, who are telling us how to live. We don't want that. We want to be away. And you see that by the Blacks in that time, they try to have their own societies and not have too much interaction with whites who are trying to govern them all the time. So that's the pit house as a symbol of the Black Loyalist experience, tells a lot of connected stories.
That's awesome. I don't know how, like, just in that little bit, you took away some of the things that I thought I knew and said, no, we got to get rid of that. And you shared with me things that I'm so grateful to know. The idea that Birchtown was settled in that place for a very particular reason, because you're right. When you look out into Birchtown Bay, it's a completely different world than when you're looking from Birchtown Bay into Birchtown. Now, for those that don't know Birchtown at all, it's just a matter of when you see land from the ocean, you see land, you see farms, you see trees, you see something to do, you see a place to be. When you see the ocean from the land, you see the world, especially at a time when that's how so much travel was. So Birchtown wasn't just a matter that they were settled there because that's where they were placed. Birchtown is also a symbol of this was an entry place, an entry point for these people to explore the world, to invest in the world and to have the world invest in them. That's fantastic. Real quick, Graham, I just Julie, thank you so much for your donation. Vinix, thank you so much for your donation, and Annie for yours. I'm incredibly grateful for all this so far. We're talking with Graham Nickerson, who is a maritime historian. Now, you've alluded to the little conversation we've had coming into this. For those who subscribe to my channel, I did a video a little while back talking about how so much of the history that I grew up with didn't include the story of people of African descent and their impact in the Maritimes. One of the things that Graham mentioned to me, and again, as a student of history, as a person who thought they knew about their hometown a little bit, actually quite a bit, Graham, you mentioned that there is an African connection, people of African descent, whether they're refugees or loyalists, to the Miramichi.
Yes.
A little more about that?
Okay. So we know, we'll start at the Great Fire of 1825, right? So we know through the accounts of 1825 that, and there are some sources, and I can, if somebody's interested, I can provide the links later, because I'm sure there are people who know the Miramichi who are like, wait a minute, what's he talking about? Including you, like 15 minutes ago.
I'm not going to doubt you.
So there is an account of the Great Fire in which there's she's a little girl at the time, and she goes on to write her journals, and I can't remember. You might know who she is, but anyway, she talks about watching a minister giving a sermon at a lumber camp just outside of Newcastle, I think. And so that is actually Reverend Preston from Halifax, or the settlement of Preston is named after. And he's up there preaching as a traveling or itinerant minister, which is pretty common in the Black community. Just like David George he was a traveling minister. So there is apparently a folk song in Wales about the Blacks in Miramichi who bang drums and notify the people in Miramichi that this fire is approaching. So there is a Black community. There is an unfortunate Black woman who's in the Newcastle jail at the time when the fire goes through, and she perishes inside the jail. And so I don't know why that is, but the easiest or the most reasonable trajectory that gets people there is Benjamin Marston ends up there. So that means that Loyalists ended up traveling up through there. So he used Blacks when he surveyed in Shelburne. So maybe he ends up bringing them with him, or there are servants who go up with Loyalists who travel up through Fredericton and then over to the Miramichi, or there was a Black settlement in Prince Edward Island. And one thing I'm going to tell you right now, which is going to shock you, because most people don't know this, Prince Edward Island is the only province in Canada that legalized slavery. And not just like the benign slave master type slavery, it was a brutal form of slavery with very severe punishments and treatment of Blacks. And there's a book by called Black Islanders that talks about all this stuff, and it's shocking. So there maybe the connection between the coast in northern New Brunswick and the coastal communities in Prince Edward Island, or for that matter, Cape Breton, because there's a Black Loyalist community in and around there. So we don't really know yet, or I don't know anyway. Maybe somebody out there knows. But we did, one thing that's really cool is I'm involved with a project called the Tomlinson Lake Hike to Freedom, which, so Tomlinson Lake just outside of Perth Andover in New Brunswick was one of the northernmost terminuses of the Underground Railroad. And so we do a hike there every October, and we did the first or second hike. A woman came to us and gave us a note, and after she left, we read it, and she was a descendant of Blacks in the Miramichi, and she thanked us about for doing the hike, and mentioned in there that they didn't talk about the Black heritage because they were embarrassed by it, which is a pretty common. If you're old enough, I grew up that way, being, you just see yourself as a descendant of slaves, and it's not anything to be proud of. But the conversation is so much more rich now. So,
are you
my
noticing?
Research? Oh, sorry.
Are you noticing? Are things getting better along those lines? I mean, that is something here in Shelburne that I think I noticed when I first moved here, is that some people just didn't want to talk about it.
Is it getting better? Sometimes it is. Sometimes we take a step backwards. I think the last probably from the say 2015, 2016, that following 4 years weren't such a great time to be Black. There's a lot of, you had to fight for your space.
Mm-hmm.
But on the plus side, a lot of Blacks connected and saw that, like, your experience is my experience. Like, my entire life, people have been telling me I'm just being sensitive. But then you see everybody out there who's an activist is being told, oh, you're being sensitive. And unfortunately, it meant watching a man die in front of your eyes for 10 minutes for people to really go, wait a minute, like, this is where we are as a society, and it needs to change.
How do you see the experiences of those people of African descent that came to the Maritimes? How does their experiences, as varied as you've described them to be, from not only from like personal experiences, but just from the context that they came from the backgrounds they grew up in, from their education levels, from their skills ability. I think one of the things that I'm going to take away from this talk, honestly, is I'm probably going to try to stop using the term Black loyalist to describe so many people. But from those experiences of those people of African descent that came to the Maritimes around that time, how does their experience, do you think, how do you think their experience speaks to us today?
That's a great question. And I don't know if I have the answer. I think we're trying to see, like, we don't know who Black loyalist descendants are, right? Because if you look around now, there's no sign that, like, 10 or 20% of the population of where you live was Black, right? There's no huge Black settlement in Birchtown. There is no huge Black settlement up and back at Shelburne. There's no Black settlement on McNutt's Island. There's just stories and a few of the descendants that are left. And then the network of Black descendants who stretch into Canada, but also back into the US. So we know in other places there you can see sort of the ties between Black loyalism and a spirit of revolt. Like in the Caribbean, Black loyalists are both influenced and influence slave resistance before the American Revolution and after. But it's hard to see it in our own society, I think, because the British, we just don't have a space in which Blacks could be openly resistant to the white power structure. So I think by and large, they indicated their dissatisfaction with the status quo in British North America by going back to the US. So places like Boston, New York, other places along the way, and we're really just making those connections now of, like, oh, they were, like, getting into the census data and the records and going, they were Black loyalists. If we look at 1,000 of these people, what's different about them than the Blacks who never left, right? What changed after they started to come back? I would say that for we as a people, Black Loyalists, and there's a Black Loyalists in Nova Scotia, they're in New Brunswick and elsewhere, and in Britain. We're this like the fly in the ointment, because when Americans talk about liberty, that didn't apply to us. And so they see themselves as the good guys against the British. And we see the British as the good guys against American slavery. Yet neither Britain or the United States acknowledge that we exist in popular culture by and large. So we're only just beginning that conversation to sort of map out how we're going to relate to each other. And within the Black Loyalist community, we're those of us from Shelburne and who have this great center, the Black Loyalist Museum in Birchtown, is that we have this tremendous opportunity to network with Black Loyalists in Britain, in the US, the other provinces, Sierra Leone, and dealing with the Creoles, because that's a whole other part of our story of a Black Loyalist experience that has not really been taken to our bosom as Black Loyalists to say they are us, and there's this whole huge story that we need to tell.
Thank you for that. I want to come back to ask you something. I just want to say some thanks here first. Virginia, thank you for your donation. Mel, thank you for your donation. John Nolan, I think I know that guy. Thank you for your donation. And Psychos Are Nuts. Fantastic name. Thank you for your donation. You mentioned something that sort of triggered a thought, here it's the Revolutionary War. In the United States, I have friends who refer to that exact same period of time, that exact same event, as the War of Independence. You make mention that for those people of African descent, the people that we come to know as patriots, the revolutionaries, the rebels, for people of African descent who ended up leaving, they were the bad guys. They weren't seen as the good guys, and for but the English, who were seen as the bad guys from the perspective of the War of Independence, they were considered the good guys. Now, when we talked a little bit earlier this week, you made mention of something about George Washington and his role in sort of how this all folded. Can you go back and talk about that?
Oh, you had to bring up George Washington.
Yeah, I did. Yeah.
So I apologize to our American viewers who are watching this for what I'm about to say, but I mean, George Washington was a defender of slavery. He wasn't there. There's this rehabilitation of his persona that's happened, right? That he's like the benign slave owner who wasn't like every other slave owner at the time. But we know through the sources that he corrected his slaves. He circumvented emancipation laws in Pennsylvania. He had a ornate strategy to transport his cycle, rotate his slaves through Pennsylvania so that they couldn't be freed. So they can live with him for 11 months and 29 days. And then now you're going back to Virginia. So that he could keep his slaves. He had slaves who ran away from him. So there are 3 Black Loyalist slaves that I'm aware of. One of them ended up in New Brunswick. Henry Washington ended up in Birchtown. And not only that, but he also the French allies, he approached them and sort of like, you have Blacks that belong to Americans and we want them back. That was definitely his position when they negotiated the Treaty of Paris. Washington is a big promoter of the return of blacks into enslavement. And in fact, that affects my family. There is a document that I just found a little while ago of my great grandfather's, probably his first wife, who petitioned the British to come to Nova Scotia from in New York, and she was denied and returned back to Virginia. So that was always a big thing for him, was the return of enslaved people to patriots. And so it's hard to, when you see these things, well, you don't see them. We don't talk about that stuff. No. So Washington he's monumental in bringing American independence, but he's a man and he's complicated like every other person. And he has a story that he's not a saint, and he's a man of his times. And in some ways that argument's been made. He's not a man of his times. He's a segment of the population of his time who justifies slavery and argues for it when others are trying to not have slavery. And he's circumventing the laws that they made for emancipation to protect slavery, even when in areas where it's been outlawed. So
now I'm just going to let you know, pretty much in the chat, nobody wants you apologizing for telling them the truth. Okay,
that's great.
That's what everybody's saying. It's like, nope, don't apologize, don't apologize, don't apologize. Bothered Boy, thank you for what's bothering me today. Bothered Boy, thank you for your donation. Along those lines, so we talked about George Washington. Julie, thank you for your donation. We talked about George Washington. Tell me about, and you see me wearing the collar, so I'm going to ask, I want to know, what role did the church play in all of this?
Okay, so I just to get it out there, like I'm not a religious person, so I don't have that side of it. Isn't for me. It's not that. I'm not anti-religious. I see it as data, and I see it as things that from a historian's point of view, it's like, okay, here's this thing about these people that tie them together, and it means, like, as people in the future would look at this conversation and say, oh well, it was the church that had this podcast. It was a religious person, and does that mean something? I would say that it probably does. Then standing back, this is actually a great question. And so here's another thing that's somewhat controversial, but it needs to be said, and people need to be aware. And if they get wound up about it, you can go look at the sources, go look at the records. It's there, and you can see it. So if we need to take 1783, 1784, and we just forget that the Black Loyalists are Black. Okay, so we'll set that aside. We'll say David George was not a Black Loyalist. David George was a Loyalist. Boston King was a Loyalist. David George, as a Baptist or a dissenter, is going around stirring up trouble in the South Shore of Nova Scotia and in New Brunswick. Okay, as a Baptist, like Baptists in the U.S., if you go back and look in the U.S., there was no love for Baptists there. If you were British or Tory before the Revolution, the Baptists are like, we don't want to pay taxes to support the Anglican Church. We don't go. So they're getting thrown in jail and beaten, and the mob violence and all that stuff. So it's happening there. So the Shelburne riots, they're called the Sheldon race riots. They're not race riots. Okay, race factors in there, but it's not. It's economic and it's religious. And if you look before the big outbreak of the violence, David George is baptizing people into the Baptist Church. And the Congregationalists and the Anglicans are like, whoa, wait a minute. Like, we're not having this. If you look at in Liverpool, Simeon Perkins' diary, there's between the Baptists and the Congregationalists, there's all-out war between those two groups. And it is people from Liverpool that David George is baptizing in 1783, when all of her people, or their people from Liverpool, show up, and probably including Simeon Perkins, and disrupt the baptism. It hasn't. So we need that racial lens is partly on us, right? It's not just them. It's not how we see the world, and not just how they see the world. So people like David George and the other church leaders, John Merritt is another one who comes through. Like John Merritt he's amazing. Like he's scholars everywhere talk about John Merritt. John Merritt lived in Birchtown. Like you have to go look it up. He's one of the major Black narratives of the 18th century. And Shelburne, there's another statue or plaque that needs to go up, right? So
again, never heard the name before.
I know, like neither did I. And then I'm like, wait a minute, like, what do you mean? All these people came through, and Freeborn Garretson, who's not Black, but they're traveling through, looking at these free Black communities. Anyway, I'm going on. Let's get back on track. So, to answer your question and to circle back to what we talked about with the military side. So coming early on, the military organization of the Black Loyalists is how the society seems to have run. But moving through time, it really is the religious leaders that take over the community, the communities. And they're the ones who really have the responsibilities, and they guide the trajectory of the people who live there. And so religion has a huge role. And in fact, the people who migrate off, most of the religious leadership ends up going to Sierra Leone, which they have their own. I mean, I don't know. I only know through interacting, and there is a paper I had yet to read that's sitting in my pile of papers to read about religion in Sierra Leone. But it seems a lot like the Baptists, by and large, migrate off to Sierra Leone, whereas the Methodists and Anglicans remain behind. And I'm hoping to get to this in my thesis, is to sort of even lightly sort of say, is that if looking at this thing, are these people who stay behind, is it by and large Methodist, or is it just that it appears that way and it ties to something else? A lot of it also has to do with getting land. But Clarkson, who comes over to collect people to go to Sierra Leone, that's all through the church and the abolitionist movement, right? So, and so that's a big influence on the trajectory all the way through. And not to mention into the US, religion at that time is a big, big motivator, and it's separating. I'm meandering now, so I'm going to try and finish this really quickly. But looking through the 13 colonies, religion, how people see religion. If you're in New England and in the middle colonies, it's mostly New England Congregationalists, Quakers. And so they have this, and this is sort of like, you can't say Black Loyalists and think like you just say it and everybody understands what it is, because it's not one thing. The New England Quakers and dissenters. And then in the South, it really is more shouting Methodists. So it's a spectrum of the Methodism that sort of like draws from the African spirituality. I almost went through this whole thing without talking about African spirituality. So the whole shouting Methodism and the Baptist part of baptism, or baptism part of Baptist, it has a direct tie to African spirituality and the relationship and the role of water. Water is a spiritual conduit in West African spirituality. Water cleanses one, one's old life and redeems one into a new spiritual life. And so Africans saw that if they died, as long as they were close to water and the water could connect them to Africa, their spirit would go back to Africa and they would be reborn. So
that's beautiful.
It's one of those things where you ask, it's like you can either get really angry about having religion presented to you and yourself removed from it, or you can be happy. Like, I'm happy to have this knowledge now and to be able to talk about it. And sort of, it's like, actually, I'm really annoying because, and my kids are upstairs, but they're like, oh God, it's history talk again. Because it's just like, it's like every topic has this black anti-topic where you just, it's like Miramichi. Well, there's black Miramichi. And if you hear that every day, you get tired of it. But it's really empowering to have the knowledge and convey it, and hopefully other people pick it up and own it.
You know, the hope I think would be that soon it's such widespread common knowledge that it just becomes part of the lexicon, that it's there.
Yes.
You know?
Yep.
Let's see. So somebody just asked the question, what's going on? It was Getting Meyer asked, what's going on? Yeah, I guess there was a mix up with the time zones, but we're talking with Graham Nickerson. If anybody has any questions that you'd like to ask Graham, he's speaking about the history of people of African descent here in the Maritimes, and how it connects with a much, much greater world. Like, to call you a maritime historian is to do you a disservice.
Well, thanks for the flattery. It's probably the reason that my master's is going to take so long to finish.
Yeah, you're never going to finish.
Well, it's like every time you open a paper, you're like fall into this rabbit hole of like, I don't even know this. It isn't like I'm going, oh, here's this thing that I'm just going to learn more about. It's like you turn a page and it's like, wait a minute. I never knew this. Why don't I even know? Why don't I even know this? And then the answer is we have structures in place that are preventing us from this discussion that we're tearing down. And that's the thing. We need to get those barriers out of the way, and then move forward into the real, or this version of reality anyway.
I want to come back towards the end. I want to come back and ask you a deep question along those lines, because of where I am, because of who I am, and because of what I've grown up with. But I want to come back to the Black Loyalists a little bit. Again, in our preamble, you mentioned to me a concept that I had never heard before, and I'd love to hear more about it. And I think everybody here would be interested in it as well. You said it was the Black Atlantic theory, the Black Atlantic. Do you remember that?
The Black Atlantic, yes. So the Black Atlantic is, it's a turn in history. So the term turn means it's like, you see, there's a way that we look at something, and a turn is like, we may have been looking at this all wrong, and now we're going to pivot and look at it in a different way, from a different perspective. And the Black Atlantic is sort of the subclassification of the Atlantic. And so the Atlantic sort of takes the Atlantic Ocean and treats it like this social construct that ties all of the port cities and then hinterlands together. And the Atlantic Ocean is this cultural highway that connects everybody together. The Black Atlantic then looks at the Blacks' role and place in the Atlantic. And it is significant. It is so, the Caribbean is really, like what we've done in this sort of reconstruction of our place in the world is we've separated ourselves from the Caribbean, and sort of now it's this place off down there. If you're up here in Canada, and I'm only paraphrasing my concept of how people think about it, not how I think about it. I love you, my Caribbean brethren and sisters. So we are together. And culturally, we're only figuring out how we're connected, but we're there. Anyway, I'm getting ahead of myself. This is what I'm like. I'm like this all the time. I apologize. So what we did is we stuck the Caribbean at sort of the margins of our consciousness because it serves a purpose. It's sort of like slavery and blackness, that's all down there. It's not here. But in reality, the Caribbean it's central to the 18th and earlier. I mean, it's central to the economics of the U.S. and Canada and the 13 colonies and Britain. Most of the money that's being made is being made in the Caribbean. Most of the slaves that are being transported into British territories are going into the Caribbean, and it's just this triangular trade that is a conveyor belt of black bodies and turning it into sugar or other commodities. And then feeding that conveyor belt is North Atlantic fish and North Atlantic timber and American corn and wheat. And so triangular trade it's this mechanism of just pouring Africans into slavery and for production. So that's one of the mechanisms of the Atlantic. And it's pretty, once you start, like what I normally do, if I do school kids, I'll bring breakfast to class, and I'll be like, that, like bread, the molasses in that made this bread, or the sugar that raised the bread came from the Caribbean. It probably sailed on by a boat with black sailors. Up to 5 to 20% of English ships had black mariners on it, up to 50% for the French. So that's the Black Atlantic, so those are physical bodies. But then it's like the whole idea of liberty. So Creoles originally, early on, so Matthew DaCosta, right? If most Canadians should be familiar with him. Are you familiar with Matthew DaCosta?
Have I been familiar with anything else? No.
There is a Canadian stamp.
Oh, yes. Okay. Yes, of course. Yes. That much. The guy on the stamp. Gotcha.
Yep. Okay. So he's a Creole. So he represents this early relationship of blacks with North America. And so the Creoles they're Euro-African or Afro-Europeans who are part of the slave trade, part of exploration, mercantile roles and exploration. And so they come to North America first. Champlain has Matthew DaCosta, and you can find in historical records would be the odd black person who's been reported in the 1600s, say. And so Matthew DaCosta, he's a Creole, which also those people end up in the Caribbean early on. And so they have this mindset of themselves as being free, or at least in a relationship where they have some say, or a lot of say, about what they're going to do. And so there is actually Port Latour, the community I was talking about. There's a guy named La Liberté who was there in the 1680 census and lived on Cape Negro, as ironically. So there were Creoles here. And the thing that the Creoles do is tie the Portuguese and Spanish to, in Africa, to the Africans, in North America, to the First Nations. And so they're speaking a Portuguese trade language that developed through the fisheries. And so, and that has strong ties to the Caribbean. And then, so they have this empowerment that bleeds through slavery through the centuries, and nobody in North America wants Creoles there once chattel slavery has been established, because they're too rebellious. And in fact, it's like the valuable slaves end up in the Caribbean, and the castaways, from a white perspective, end up in North America. So so there's that whole connection. And so there are Caribbean blacks in this area from the very beginning. And that's the Black Atlantic. It's like there's these highways between everywhere, and people travel on them, Black people travel on them, and they have cultural impact, and they are indicators of a bigger picture.
That network is so much vaster than just a matter of some New England freed slaves who come north.
Yes, and that's our perception of it is generally a result of having these people removed from the historical narrative. So.
Can I ask? I know, you know what? I apologize for your throat. I can hear you're starting to get a little dry.
No, it's okay.
But I'm going to ask you a question that I think is. I'm going to ask you a question that I have a suspicion is going to set you completely off. But before I do that, I just want to let everybody know in the chat that any donations that come through Super Chats today, we're going to put that towards the creation and the commemoration of a plaque for a pastor by the name of David George, who was of African descent, who served here in Shelburne. He was widely well known all over the Atlantic coast of the United States and Canada, and whose name has largely been forgotten for many of us today. So if whatever you if you have a question or anything like that you'd like to ask, I will happily see if I catch it in the comments. I'll make sure that Graham hears it. The question I have for you that I think is going to set your brain off. Are you ready? What of all, because you're talking about finding stuff, and as you said, you think everything's been written about history, and then you turn a page, or you open a ledger, or you open a record of birth or something along those lines, and the next thing you know, you're off and running on another topic that you had no idea it was even there. But of all that you've discovered, what do you sort of hold to as the most precious piece of information that you've discovered from your research, from your studies?
Okay. The most impactful, I would say, the one that resonates with me as much as anything or more, is the story of, so I'll go backwards in time a little. And so my family, so my father was a Bruce, actually. So I have my mother's maiden name, which is another story. But my father was a Bruce. And so we go back through time and into the census data. And so there's, my family comes from Lockport, Nova Scotia, Green Harbor, Nova Scotia, Louis Head. So out in Sable River, there's a Black community that was out there. And so there's Anne Lawrence would be my great grandmother, who lived in Louis Head in the mid 1800s, and she had children by her employer, who lived in Lockport at the time. And her story really is one it's pretty hard reading to get through, and she has these children by her employer, and she's left to raise them on her own. They are in the census for 1880, I'm going to say. My great grandfather John Bruce is living as a servant in Louis Head, and his sister, I'm not sure where she is at that time. But then, so they're already, I mean, people say slavery ended in 1833 here. I'm fairly suspicious that being a servant in 1870 was much better. Well, I mean, within reason, there was some legal framework there to protect them. But I mean, you're economically tied to the power structure, and you're stuck in a subservient role. And so Anne ends up, she has a number of children by different people, and she's, in one census, she's 60 or 65 years old, and she's a housekeeper for a family that's even poorer than her, younger than her. And then she just sort of disappears. And so I've cried over this woman's story a few times, and I've done it a lot. I've raged. Because it just, I've opened myself up to the stories, to own them and tell them. And so what ends up happening though is, so I thought she was gone forever from documentation, but she ended up passing away in the poorhouse in Sandy Point. And so she didn't die alone, and her body wasn't thrown into a ditch somewhere or whatever. She died around people who probably cared somewhat for her, and she did get laid to rest, and she's now in Pine Grove Cemetery in Shelburne. So she's on the monument in Pine Grove for the people who passed away at the poorhouse. But her story, once, like, you have to accept that that's the way it was. I'm not happy about it, but I accept it. But the impact and the ties that she has through the Black Atlantic is that her daughter married, so her daughter Anne, so her name was Rebecca, and her daughter is Anne. And Anne married a sailor from St. Martin's in the Caribbean. So already it's sort of like, well, how did that happen? Well, now we know, through the highway that connects the Caribbean to us. And he dies at sea, and she marries a Keeling from Port Latour, which, when I read, this is one of these things you read, Port Latour, there ain't no Black people out in Port Latour. But there were, and lots of them. And so she married into a Keeling. Keelings descend from a guy named Argyle Keeling. And Argyle Keeling was a member of the Royal Artillery in New York, and maybe during the Southern Campaign. Argyle Keeling ran away in 1779, joined up with the Highlanders who lived around the 42nd Highlanders, who were in the Chesapeake, stirring up trouble at that time. And so it's just this big, long connection back in through time where you're like, oh, and the real interesting thing that spins out of all of this, I'm telling her story, their story, and my own story of discovery. Argyle Keeling spent the winter of 1783 in St. Stephen, Milltown, New Brunswick, in a community of 200 people, 200 Black people. It's not on the map. It's not in the public history. I'm hoping to publish about this in the future, but it's virtually unknown. And it changes the entire story that we tell about the Shelburne race riot, for instance. These guys are the Black Brigade. So one last thing about that, and then I'll stop, I promise. Is they're the last people to leave New York City in November 30th, 1783. When they're leaving, they nail the British flag over Fort George. They nail it to the flagpole, and then grease the pole so that when George Washington comes and takes possession of New York City, he can't lower the flag. And they're all on the ships sailing out of the harbor. Ah, ha, ha, ha. And as one last defiant act against the Patriots and their former enslavers.
How does that make you feel?
I feel like I'm an inheritor of this sense of rebellion to slavery and racism that doesn't quite fit, right? So, what do you do? It's like if you grew up. I mean, you just think about it. Anybody out there, you think you grew up and you think I'm a piece of crap, and everything that I see about myself reinforces that feeling, right? You don't see successful Black people. Every stereotypical thing. I'm 51, so I was born in '69, not far out of those black and white pictures of people waving Confederate flags, I can tell stories about that whole experience. But then you peel off that part of your life, and it's filled in with this I inherit this rich history of Blackness that impacts our whole society, and most people don't know it. So I get to tell them, and sometimes I argue with them. So it's nice being educated, intelligent, and you get when I was younger and I was in these situations, I didn't know anything. So it's like I'm with these white people, and they're telling me that blackface shouldn't be offensive, and I'm just being sensitive. But now I'm like, okay, well, I can tell you about. You want to talk about blackface? Let's start at the very beginning, and so I don't have those arguments anymore. I just I'm armed against it. So.
Graham, we've only got a couple of more minutes, and then I'm going to let you go.
Okay.
I'm so grateful for this. I'm so grateful for this time. Is there anything? Oh, and by the way, I asked you that question about the most fascinating thing. My wife told me to ask what was the most impactful thing. So because you said the most impactful thing was, I'm going to hear about that. So just letting you know. And I don't want to stir anything up here. You said you were born in 1961?
69.
69. So for what it's worth, anybody out there that thinks Graham looks like he's about 25, 26, there is something here in Shelburne that if you're from Shelburne, you've eaten something, you drank something at some point that is going to keep you looking young forever. There are people in my congregation that are like 147 and they look 40.
Yeah, it's I'm the Bruce, my Bruce.
I knew it. I knew you had to be a Bruce.
So we all look kind of alike, and we all look young. People are dying, and they're like, how did they die? Old age. Well, he's only 30. No, he's actually he's 75.
Yeah. So if you're out there and you want to look young, you got to live in Shelburne for a few years. Apparently it's the thing. What I'd like to ask you now, we have, about Founders Days.
Yes.
Again, for those out there, and I better reintroduce you again. This is Graham Nickerson. He is a maritime historian. He's a student moving towards his master's degree. He's studying Black history in the Maritimes. And quite honestly, if you can go back and watch this video, how it's interconnected with just about everything across all over the Atlantic. Here in Shelburne, every year we have something called Days, and Founders Days is a weekend we take where we celebrate the Loyalists coming to Shelburne, and we put dories on the water, and we have reenactors dressed up as soldiers and as settlers, and they even go so far as to camp on the waterfront. And of course, we have the deep fried donuts and all the other tasty foods that we're supposed to have. Actually, I do have two questions for you. Because this one also relates to Founders Days. But how do you think we could celebrate Founders Days in a way that better reflects and respects and honors those people of African descent that also landed here in Shelburne?
Okay. I'm gonna show you something in a second. So I'm actually a board member for the, as you opened up with, board member for the Black Loyalist Heritage Society. And my chair is, I run Back to Birchtown with great help from all of the employees and staff and other board members. It's not just me, but that's my portfolio. And so we are aligning Back to Birchtown celebration with Founders Day to bring the story together, because it shouldn't be separate. It's not two different stories, and we got to get past the whole racial bias part of it and what's happened in our history. Like the Black history and this white, no, it's just history. Now you're talking about the reenactors. I'm gonna go get something. Hold on.
While he's getting that, I'm going to mention again that any of the super chat donations that come in, we're going to put that towards creating a memorial and commemorating a memorial plaque for a pastor from the late 1870s who was here of African descent by the name of David George. Okay, you're back. You're going to show us something.
Yeah, and so I have it's kind of weird because it's the background effects kind of impacting it, but I have my 1763 French carbine. I'm a reenactor, and so I play a black pioneer or black brigade, and so everything I have is basically a part of the story, and I talk about what we did as Black Loyalists during the American Revolution, and it's substantial. In all parts. There are 4,000 Blacks who served the British during the American Revolution in one form or another. And the disruption caused by Blacks running off from their owners was something that was significant enough that they put an article in the Treaty of Paris, Article 7, and it kept George Washington awake at night. So anyway, so that's essentially to build that Black presence in commemoration and in the story. I mean, what better way than have some Black Loyalists on the waterfront camping out? We were there. There's a guy named Titus Milner who actually led white units during the war. And if you are familiar with the miniseries Turn, about the Culpeper spy ring, Titus Milner should have been there. And so John Simcoe and Titus Milner led raids into New Jersey and Westchester County. And Titus Milner is like, he's the guy, right? If he were any race, he's the guy. And he ends up getting shot in the hand and dying of lockjaw. And the person who shot him gets hung. The British are like, yeah, okay, we've got you in jail. We're taking you to the shore and we're hanging you. And they do. A guy named, I think it's Joshua Huddy, which causes an international incident between the Patriots and the British. So it's just, there's so much stuff and we need it. Like if dressing up like a Black pioneer on the waterfront gets more people to understand just how significant, and it's not just like there's this guy trying to promote Black history. It's more than that. And
it's our history, right?
It's history. Yes, it's the trajectory of Western civilization has this Black component, and things really only make sense once you recognize and acknowledge the Black part of that story.
Wow. Now, the other question I have, and thank you so much for that, man. You're fantastic. I am so grateful that we had this conversation.
Thank you.
The next time you're in the area, we'll have to head down to the tap room, to the Boxing Rock tap room, and have a pop. But the last question I have is, when we talk about the Loyalists here in Shelburne, we talk about, because this was already a small little community before the Loyalists arrived, before the Loyalists began to arrive. When they began coming, they were given land grants. So including Black Loyalists, they were given land grants. And obviously, sadly, those of means were given the best lands. Those without means, the poor, were given the worst lands. But those lands belonged to somebody before we got here.
Yes.
What were the relationships like for the Black community that settled here, that grew here? What was their relationship like with the indigenous peoples of the area?
That's a good question, and it's a complicated relationship. So remember when I said that we're part of history, and so we're part of the settler society. Black Loyalists, as much as we're willing to acknowledge it or not, we are settlers. We are the enslaved, but we're also, we disenfranchise other people. But the general pattern with Blacks in North America is that we end up, as the First Nations communities rescind from the coastline, we end up taking up that cultural space that's left behind. And we work with the remaining First Nations, or we coexist with the First Nation communities, and we inherit those cultural connections. And so when you look at places like Shelburne, I think was Port Reservoir, so there were probably French Acadians living here already, and living with the Mi'kmaq. But in other areas like Port Latour, where as you get closer to Cape Sable, that's an enclave, a pretty strong enclave of First Nations historically, and that's why the French settled there in the first place, was a trade with the First Nations. So there are stories of First Nation people killing Blacks in the area as members of the settler society. So it wasn't perfect, but we did over time. We intermarried with First Nation families. I have First Nation people in my family tree, and ended up coexisting on the margins. If you find a dump, you'll probably find Black people and First Nations people living there together.
And that is something we have here in Shelburne, is that environmental racism that's systematic here.
It's systematic pretty much everywhere.
Yeah.
When you look.
So yeah, go ahead.
I was going to say, I just want one thing that I wanted to do before we stop.
Mm-hmm.
Is that, like, I know you have your Australian peeps there who are like, oh, you didn't mention us. I bet he can't talk about the connection. So the connection with Australia is the 1849 bare knuckle champion in Australia is a Black Loyalist who went by the name of the Black Sailor, who was from Annapolis, Nova Scotia. He ended up there as a Black poor. Billy Blue was the first harbor master in Sydney, and he was a Black poor who ended up in London, a Black Loyalist. Billy Blue may have been related to, there's a Mary Blue Black Loyalist who probably ended up in Green Harbor, which was once called Blue Harbor. There's an island called Blue Island. So there's all of these little connections. We just don't have the documentation yet to know how these all tie together. But Australia, and it's crazy that Australia and Green Harbor, Nova Scotia, could be connected through family ties of Black Loyalists. And it's always like that. It's always, you look and it's always like that. Crazy stuff.
That's amazing. That is absolutely amazing. Now we're going to wrap up. So the last thing I have for you, is there something that you want us all to know?
Want you all to know. I think the main thing, and the reason why I'm here, well, to talk about Black history, I'll do that anytime, is that we need to start acknowledging these people, right? That we're struggling, like, okay, we're acknowledging their existence, but when you go to like my idea of like Queens and Shelburne and Yarmouth County is that our tourism strategy and our presence and marketing, at least if it can be 50-50 Black oriented and white. So that, because if you drive in, the road in, the way into Shelburne, if you're traveling from Tim Hortons into Shelburne, that welcome to Shelburne sign is located in Blacktown, which is probably the community that the Shelburne rioters burnt down. And you don't, welcome to Shelburne, you don't see a Black person on the Shelburne sign, either end of the town. We need that to change. We need a Black-centric strategy that incorporates both of us. Black people everywhere who know about this stuff, Americans who want to know more, people will come. People will come to Shelburne and to other places when they know that this history is there and that all these people came through. We need to get our minds in and accept that that's our history and embrace it.
That is a brilliant way of connecting our past to our future. Like the reality of our past, because you're right. For those that don't live in this area, we are heavily inundated with the concept of the Loyalist, but it is very much the romantic version of the Loyalist, the red coat, the clean, the proper, the prim, the debutante kind of Loyalist image. But the reality of the history, and that's what I'm taking away from this conversation, to be honest with you. I mean, apart from the details that you shared, but the facts that history is incredibly complicated. History is George Washington is incredibly complicated. The relationships that we've had are incredibly complicated. The networks that we've existed within are incredibly complicated. It's not one way. It sounds like it's a million ways. And the more we can understand all of those things, as you just made mention, all of a sudden, knowing the reality of our past gives us an opportunity to step into the future here.
Yeah.
That's brilliant. Man, thank you so much for being here. I know you said you're not religious, but I hope you please I pray God's blessings upon you. I am so grateful for this time. You are an incredible resource, and I can't wait to see the things that you're going to do. The next time you're down this area, or the next time I'm up in Fredericton, I'm going to give you a call, and we should do something.
Thanks very much. I really appreciate it. Thanks for having me, and I'm glad to be able to reach out to your people and talk about our history.
Perfect, man. I'm going to, I will be cutting this up and putting it out on YouTube. I'll send you the links so that you can share them as well. And everybody out there, I hope you'll share the links, not only because, the channel's awesome and the comment section in every video is so awesome. You guys are all so loving and tender to one another, but because this is going to help share Graham's story, which is a part of the story of the people of African descent that settled here in the Maritimes. But as you've heard, it's all of our story, because it does, man, this network is just amazing.
You'll have to get your reenactment clothes together, and we'll hang out and talk during Founders Day.
Well, I might come down and see you with some donuts.
Fair enough.
Graham, thanks very much for being here. I'm going to let you go while I sign off with everybody else. God
right,
bless you,
thank you.
Graham.
All right. Thank you.
Folks, thanks so much for being here. I'm really grateful. I hope it worked. I haven't watched the video. I have no idea what the quality was like. I hope it was good. Thank you for your comments. Thank you for interacting with each other. Thank you for your donations. I don't know how I can check to see how much came in. Thanks, Leon. Thanks, Leon, for the donation. Thank you, everybody that participated. I am, yeah. So next month we're going to look at doing this again at the last Saturday of the month. It'll be 2:00 Eastern Standard Time. And I think next month I'm going to try to either talk to a theologian about anarchy and Christianity and how those things go together, or I made a promise that we'd bring in a feminist theologian. So we're going to be looking at doing something along those lines. Joshua Brown, thank you so much for your donation. One last thing. As you know, on this site, there's a link to something called Canada Helps. That allows me to set up a special fund. If you give me a few minutes, what I'm going to do is I'm going to set up a special fund in Canada Helps so that anybody watching this video that isn't that didn't catch it live, you can donate to Canada Helps for the memorial plaque in honor of Pastor David George. Thank you, everybody. God bless you. May the Lord bless you. May the Lord keep you. May the Lord's face be made to shine upon you. May the Lord's countenance be lifted up to you. May you always know the peace of being in the Lord's presence. And I pray that no matter what we discover about ourselves in our histories, we'll find ourselves secure, knowing that who we were can inform us and help us navigate who we want to become. Amen.